Yay!
Good for you.
Happy to see you.
Yeah, well,
How are you?
It was a rough couple of months, so I
Yes.
personal restoration. So, well, it's really nice to see you all, and I know it's at least a couple of different groups. So let me just offer a few words. The first thing I want to say is thank you. This is a really difficult time for the country. It's a really difficult time for citizens. People are scared. Vulnerable populations are really imperiled. And so your willingness to stand up for each other, for yourselves, for our shared values is really empowering to me. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that. The other thing that I guess in my sort of personal evolution as a leader is I have come to appreciate the value of institutions in our democracy. You know, I think a lot of us start as young radicals, and then sometimes we end up being radicals all the way through. And but I think when you're 19 years old and you're advocating for progressive causes in a lot of instances, it is worthwhile, important, part of the job, part of the role to speak truth to power and to advocate sometimes against, maybe not the institution itself, but whatever the institution is doing. And one of the lessons I'm taking from this very difficult time is that I think we can be aggressive in our progressivism, but part of what makes America such a special place is our institutions, right? And it's sometimes the institutions that we don't, that we're not always thrilled with, like how they conduct themselves, that we argue about. Maybe it's the media, maybe it's federal bureaucracies, maybe it's not-for-profit organizations, maybe it's the legislative branch, maybe it's the judicial branch. But those institutions, in my view, are more important than ever in terms of what it means to have civil society. I talk a lot with a couple of friends of mine who used to work in the State Department. It's really important. One of the things that we learned over the George W. Bush era is that democracy is not simply about providing people the right to select their own leader. It is about civil society. It is about the Fourth Estate. It is about an educational equity. It is about the ability for people to access the courts. And so I just wanted to share with you at the sort of philosophical level that one of the things that I'm thinking deeply about is how to strengthen all of those institutions that actually strengthen us, even as we spend lots of our lives beating them up and telling them that they ought to be doing better and all the rest of it. So on to the substance, if you don't mind. I'll let you ask a question, I promise. On to the substance. We are, probably about 2/3 of the way through the president assembling his cabinet. And we have done something pretty extraordinary. Now that it is not a 60-vote threshold, but rather a 51-vote threshold, the way the rule runs is that you take 30 hours, but you actually have to, it's a very interesting thing. It's essentially a talking filibuster. In other words, we had what they used to call a gentleman's filibuster, which is essentially you say, I'd like to count the 30 hours, but you don't have to go down to the floor and talk. And that rule was actually changed. And now we have to go down to the floor and talk. And the Republicans really thought we wouldn't want to go down to the floor and talk. And I think they learned a lesson about our resolve. And I think they learned a lesson about what happens when Democrats talk for 30 hours with passion and unity. And so now they don't like it so much when we go down there and talk for 30 hours. It was sort of, they were calling our bluff. And, I've never given a speech longer, a prepared speech longer than maybe 20 minutes, and I've now given several 60-minute speeches on the nose, because you're not allowed to give more than 60 minutes. I hope you didn't watch the whole thing. I have clips for you. But we're, sort of halfway through that. The next tranche is Zinke, Perry, Purdue, help me out here.
Oh my God.
Ross, Carson. Anyway, there's 6 or 7 more. I haven't decided finally on every single one of them, but I can tell you that I am a no on 5 of the 7 or 8. Part of it is that when you think about advice and consent in the Constitution, you want to do each nominee individually. For instance, I think, speaking of institutions, I think General Mattis is one of the reasons that I'm occasionally able to get a full night's sleep. Is that, I don't agree with him on foreign policy, but I think he's a lawful and sane person who will periodically talk the president out of a bad idea. So that's the next couple of weeks, and then we're right into the throes of what they're going to try to do with respect to the Affordable Care Act. I am more hopeful on that than I was maybe 3 or 4 months ago. Because President Obama is no longer president, they don't have Obama as a foil. And so there was a really good article in the New York Times saying Obamacare is becoming less about Obama and more about care. And so the politics are shifting very, very quickly. And there are a lot of Republicans who know exactly, it was one thing to vote against Obamacare because basically it's one of those things where whenever you touch it, and then the rates go up or things go sideways in a healthcare system that is complicated and convoluted and illogical, then you blame it on the last, politician who touched it, which was President Obama. They know that if they touch this and anything goes wrong, and it will go badly wrong, that they will own it. Some of them are sincere ideologues and are prepared for the moral and political consequences. But a lot of them don't want to do a very unpopular thing: cut Medicaid, cut Medicare, reduce care for adults with severe and persistent mental illness, cut the ability for people to continue on their parents' plan until they're 26, cut people for having pre-existing conditions. Among those pre-existing conditions is being a woman. And so there's seriously, that sounds like a rhetorical flourish. That is considered a pre-existing condition under many health plans. So the politics are shifting, and they don't know what to do. And the smart ones, and the non-craven ones, and there are some of them, are trying to figure out how to craft an alternative to the Affordable Care Act, which retains the basic structure of the Affordable Care Act. Now, the problem is that if you want to cover people with pre-existing conditions, right? If you want to cover people until they're 26, you need a risk pool, right? In order to get the risk pool, you need the individual mandate. If you don't want an individual mandate, but you want to cover all those people, then you just have to shovel money at insurance companies. And that's extraordinarily expensive, and we don't have the resources for that. So I'm very hopeful about I don't want to say very hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I was about the Affordable Care Act. And I think what I'll do is open it up to questions, because I've talked a little longer than I expected. But since you were waiting,
I just
yes.
really wanted to comment on your philosophical statement on institutions. I don't think anyone's here is against institutions. We're here because we're worried that the institutions are no longer working, and that we're seeing corruption come out blatantly in the Trump's administration and seeing him consolidate power. And so our fear, and the reason for coming, is that we want to ensure that our representatives are making sure the institutions that were set up ideologically to work well are working well for us.
Yeah, I do not disagree with anything
Okay.
you're saying. I want you to be doing that. It's just an interesting kind of evolution, because I'm thinking, my goodness, thank God for the courts, right? And then I think, and then I think, thank God for the ACLU. And then occasionally I'll say, thank God for General Mattis, right? I mean, and you find yourself saying, thank God for people, institutions, thank God for John McCain, right? I mean, I never thought I would say that. But I think that's part of what's going on, is that there is a recognition that, I'll venture to guess that almost everybody, if not everybody in this room, is sort of left of center on the political spectrum. But one of the things that's happening that I think is going to build this movement and build, if you will, the resistance, is that there are actually people who are right of center who are saying, well, I'm for smaller government, but I don't know what this is, but this is not my father's Republican Party, right? There's nothing conservative, small c, big C, nothing Republican, small r, a big R, about what is happening to the country. And there are, I mean, I've had lots of private conversations with members of Congress on the Republican side who are frankly trying to find their moment. And we want to empower them because in the end, we do need a bipartisan resistance. Now, I think it's great that the sort of burning ember of this comes from progressive values. I think that's appropriate. But there are going to be some people with whom we disagree on foreign policy pretty vigorously, or on women's issues pretty vigorously, and yet they are lawful and patriotic human beings. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, even as I'm as ferocious as I can be in my resistance, is also to maintain at least some level of dialogue with folks, so that at the appropriate time, and it's not going to, frankly, it's not going to be in the first month, right? You can imagine your president is inaugurated, and you may have tremendous misgivings, but you're going to give them a month or two, right? Nope. And so, I mean, I'm saying these guys, it's very hard for them to get all the way to where they know they need to end up in the first couple of weeks. And so we're trying to give them some time and space, but obviously not unlimited time and space, because in the meantime, people are being harmed. This is not a theoretical proposition. Hold on, over here.
Hi, thank you for speaking so frankly, and I also just quickly want to compliment your staff on their communication skills, because if you fill out the form and say, Dear Senator Schatz, something or other, I'm getting very informative newsletters and I appreciate it. Can you speak about efforts to work with Republicans and also with members of the House on national security related questions, particularly the Russians?
Yeah.
And with Manafort in the spotlight again, and obviously what happened with Flynn and Trump's own kids saying, yeah, we're in with the Russians, you know, what's happening and what's the best we can hope for?
Well, I think this matter is of grave importance, and this is another one of those issues where there should be no left-right. This is not Team Progressive versus Team Conservative. This is Team America versus not. Really, that's what this is.
Right.
And so on that basis, my view is maybe a little different than some others in the sense that I think all strains of effort ought to be pressed upon. So, do I think there ought to be independent, do I think there ought to be a select committee? Yes. Do I think the intelligence committees ought to investigate? Yes. Do I think there ought to be possibly a special prosecutor at the appropriate time? Yes. Do I think the FBI should continue what they're doing? Yes. Do I think there ought to be a 9/11 style bipartisan commission? Yes. The reason that I say everything ought to be pursued is both sort of tactical and related to the way these different bodies would work. The Intelligence Committee has the investigatory capabilities that a select committee or a 9/11 style commission may not have, and they have professional staffers and they have access to security clearances and all that. So there's some infrastructure there that we don't want to sort of abandon. The idea of a select committee, I think, elevates it above the normal committee structure. Remember that a select committee would be a bipartisan, not nonpartisan select committee. So what that means is each party gets to nominate its members to the select committee. I am not as confident about the Republican members of that committee not being sort of handpicked to try to stuff everything under the rug. The FBI should do whatever the FBI may or may not be doing relative to any violation of federal law. So my view is we ought to push on everything and move everything forward. If you look at American history where something significant happened, it was usually not one commission or one committee. It was multiple lines of investigation. And I think the other aspect of this is that the media is going to be finding out information as we go along. The problem, frankly, with the Intelligence Committee, which is in a lot of ways the best way to go, is that they have had a tendency, for instance, with the torture report, where they do a really good job and then most of it gets redacted. So there's a couple of things, right? There's the law enforcement piece, there's the investigatory piece, but then there's the aspect of the American people need to know actually what happened. That we can't just say, James Comey says I can't comment on any pending investigation, whether it may or may not be happening, and then that's actually a perfectly appropriate thing for him to say. But then if it were in Intel and FBI, then the public doesn't ever get to come to any resolution on this. So I think we ought to push on everything. I have been on letters calling for various sort of ones of those 5 or 6 of the commissions and committees. I am also, like I said, sort of quietly trying to make sure that we have as much bipartisan support for this as possible, because I think, for instance, on ACA and on immigration and on Scott Pruitt, I think that's basically, you just basically charge up the mountain and make it a fight. On this one, I think it's extremely important that we don't harden any partisan divisions before some of these Republicans kind of come around to the idea that they've got to be on the right side of history. So we're pushing, but we also have seen some encouraging signs among probably 6 or 7 members of the Senate on the Republican side, and we want to give them room to get where they need to go. The point at which we will sort of lay down a marker is the point at which we decide, based on our observations, that something is being swept under the rug. And we're not there yet. And as long as the various investigatory processes continue apace, then we want to at least proceed as though there is good faith, even though we have some grave reservations. Somebody had a, yeah.
Can I just ask you to follow up on that? Where does Bannon fit in that?
It is, first of all, I don't have any special knowledge of how Bannon, operates in this White House. I will just say it this way: Bannon is one of the reasons everybody should be the most worried.
Yeah.
But I don't know exactly how all that fits.
But are you pushing to keep him off the National Security
Yeah,
Council?
so let me answer this question. I am working on legislation that I'm hoping to get a bipartisan co-sponsor on the composition of the National Security Council. The challenge with prescribing with great specificity that a senior advisor may not sit on the NSC is that both Democratic and Republican counsel lawyers are telling us that it's a separation of powers violation and it's not legal. And so we're trying to craft language that gets to the problem of the composition of the NSC but passes legal muster. There was another bill which I thought was
291.
Yeah, which is good, but I really don't think it's legal.
Yeah.
And it's good as a marker, and actually sometimes these things are important as a marker. So we say, we see you, we're watching this, our oversight eye is there, but since that's there and the marker has been laid down by people like Mark Warner and others who are pretty good on this, I'm trying to create a space for a bill that could actually pass. And that has to do with the specific composition of the NSC and not running afoul of these separation of powers problems.
I won't ask you to reveal who, but can you let us know whether you've got support on the GOP side?
I have what I would say is cautious optimism. I mean, listen, I mean, after last year, I'm no longer in the predicting business, but but I feel like we have dialogues going, and a lot of it is going to depend on events. I mean, my conversation opens up the line, right? And my good relationship with them opens up the line. Their patriotism opens up the line, but they have to make a judgment about at what point they're going to put country before party. And frankly, me just pushing them around on that delays the date at which they put country before party. Yes?
First of all, I'm sorry I'm late. There was someone with a switchblade who thought it would be okay to come through security, so I was a little bit late, but that was nice. Thank you. I voted for you. I'm glad I did. I wish you had more of a chance to get some things done, maybe in a couple years, that you do. But I really heard what you said about sleeping at night, and I know all of us are exhausted and probably not sleeping as well as we'd like to. And there are so many things